Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another installment of our Taiwan 2021 lecture series. Today, we're going to be shifting our focus to the Caribbean, to some virtual sun, which I think is very much needed for those of us who live in the Nordics, especially for Mark, who lives all the way up north in Tromsø. So I think Taiwan is getting a lot more attention in the Caribbean now that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has recently announced that they would support Taiwan's entry to the WHO. We have Blinken in the US, who recently stated that he wants to support the Caribbean states a lot more in their fight against the COVID pandemic. So I think it's the most worthwhile moment to chat about the Caribbean and Taiwan's small state diplomacy at work. Today we're joined by Dr. Mark Lenteng, who is a associate professor of political science at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. And without further ado, I would just give the floor to Mark and let him take over from here.
Thank you, Larissa. And I just want to say, yes, it is snowing outside here. So yes, hopefully the timing for this lecture is good. First of all, I wanted to give my thanks, first of all, to the ISDP for hosting me today. I also wanted to give a great deal of thanks to government representatives, both in SKN, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Taiwan, as well as to the Taiwan Embassy in Basse-Terre, all of whom have been invaluable in assisting me with my research, which is still very much a work in progress. So what I'll be presenting is kind of a step one of this project. And the starting point would be looking at small state diplomacy, which is an area which has experienced a bit of a renaissance lately. It's not a new topic in international relations, but it is an area which has started to get a lot more attention, especially in light of issues such as economic globalization, as well as what we're seeing in terms of the relationship between Beijing and Taipei. Now, in contrast to older theories of IR, more materialist approaches, which tend to put a greater focus on great power policies and diplomacy, for example, realism and the various branches. Newer approaches have started to pay more attention to states that are not great powers, including small states. And there have been a few attempts to define what is a small state in the international system. And this has been going on for the last few decades, but there's been some very interesting attempts to try to revisit the subject. And this is definitely relevant to the topic of how Taiwan has approached small state diplomacy, especially over the past few years. So the first point I want to make is that there is no kind of universally agreed upon definition of a small state. And it's been suggested, especially in the constructivist school of IR, that a lot of it has to do with identity and perception. Now, there have been some attempts to categorize a small state. For example, you look at land size. You look at economic output. Work by Carl Deutsch a few years back suggests that any state that produces less than 1% of the global GDP should be considered a small state. Others look at population. The World Bank, for example, uses the kind of threshold as 1.5 million. So any country under that is considered a small state. So these are all factors which have been brought in, but in many cases, they don't completely kind of round out the definition. And there's still no universally agreed cutoff line. Now, a classical approach based on the work by Robert Cohane, for example, Lilliputian's Dilemmas, that was back in the late 1960s, tended to look at small states through a very hard security lens. They tended to look at how states could potentially defend themselves, whether or not states were dependent on their larger neighbors for support, for security, and very often the need to create partnerships with larger states, including in the form of alliances. So that's been kind of a very hard power approach, but small states now are starting to factor into more recent approaches of foreign policy, as well as the strategic concerns of medium and large states. Not a new phenomenon, but with the kind of advent of critical theory, which tend to move beyond the state and move beyond the idea of great power focus, There have been a few emerging areas of small state diplomacy that are quite relevant to this case study. And the one that I want to primarily focus on is shelter theory. Now, this has been a theory which has been beginning to develop over the past few years, including via the work of Professor Baldur Thorhallsson at the University of Iceland. Now, the term shelter could be misread a bit because you talk about shelter and realists will very likely jump up and say, aha, you're talking about security. Sort of, but not quite to the same degree as what might be implied. Shelter in this case refers to external relations between, let's say, state A and state B, which tend to favor the smaller entity. Now that goes against the realist rule of thumb that if you have any relationship that is asymmetrical, so a small state and a large state, it is pretty much the large state which will benefit from small state support, and that the smaller state will be very dependent on the larger state for security and assistance. But shelter theory tends to unpack this a little bit more. For starters, it argues that small states are very distinct as international relations actors. And it argues that small states very often seek support from larger states, both for domestic as well as foreign policy interests. Small states can also very often benefit disproportionately from international cooperation, even in comparison with larger states, although small states might have to incur specific costs through these partnerships. Seeking shelter not only addresses the challenge of potential external threats, but in this case also that of internal limitations. And this is very important when one looks at the Caribbean. And shelter is not just about security. It is not just about hard power. According to shelter theory, there is also a significant amount of social and cultural relationships that have to be brought into the mix. So looking at this from a kind of a lens of the situation with Beijing and Taipei. Both are starting to engage in small state diplomacy, but in many cases in different ways. A lot of previous work on this subject has been undertaken, for example, in the Pacific Islands. And when I was based in New Zealand, I took a little bit of time to look at that as well from that particular viewpoint. But looking at the approaches of China and Taiwan to small states, there was the tendency up until recently to look at both of these cases in isolation. But like, for example, there's been quite a bit of work recently about how small states have factored into the Belt and Road, including, for example, the small states in the Indian Ocean, for example, Comoros, Maldives, and Seychelles. But also the fact that small states are starting to factor into Chinese identity building when it comes to the Belt and Road. However, with the ending of the de facto diplomatic truce that was in place between Beijing and Taipei between 2008 and 2016, this was under the Taiwanese government of Ma Ying-jeou, small state diplomacy has again become a factor in the greater arena of China-Taiwan competition. Now, how is that working? Beijing has, over the past 5 years, sought to isolate the Tsai Ing-wen government into assuming a more conciliatory stance on cross-strait relations, including prompting the Taiwanese government to acknowledge the 1992 consensus, which states that there is only one China. Now, since the ending of the truce, 8 of Taiwan's partner governments have so-called crossed the floor and recognized Beijing. In September 2019, there was a posting in a Chinese social media site operated by the People's Daily International Edition, warning that the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen in 2020 would see Taiwan's diplomatic partners reduced to 0. So yeah, policies are becoming considerably more distinct. Over the past 5 years, Beijing has also engaged in various forms of checkbook diplomacy. This was common in the pre-truce era, but we're definitely starting to see a more set of acute examples. We're seeing examples of so-called hybrid or transactional types of carrot and stick policies that China has engaged in to convince various governments to cross the floor. And one of the main arenas of this competition has been Latin America and the Caribbean, or the LAC region, as Beijing has identified this area as a key component for cross-regional diplomacy, and more recently, the development of the Belt and Road. Now, one kind of wild card in all this has been the, to put it diplomatically, erratic approaches of the US government towards the region, especially under the previous administration. And it's been argued that this has provided Beijing with a great deal more breathing space to accentuate its policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. The diplomatic switches that have taken place in the region just over the past 2 decades. We saw a few examples under the previous government of Hu Jintao in Beijing, including the decisions by Bahamas, Dominica, and Grenada to recognize Beijing, and the decision by St. Lucia in 2017 to recognize Taipei. Now, the situation quieted, as I said, under the diplomatic truce after 2008, but with the election of Tsai Ing-wen, Beijing's interests in swaying Taiwan's partners in Latin America and the Caribbean have resumed. The Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Panama were recent examples. Despite US pressure, they agreed to switch recognition to Beijing. And at present, there are 15 governments that recognize Taiwan, including 4 states in Central America, 4 in the Caribbean, and 1 in South America, specifically Paraguay. So overall diplomatic contacts between China and the Caribbean have accelerated, and they've increased considerably just over the past 5 years, with, for example, China engaging in what has been called mass diplomacy as well as vaccine diplomacy. That said, though, we are starting to see some shifts in policy from Taiwan towards its partners in the region. This has partially taken place due to some of the kind of more pressing policies that Beijing has undertaken in the region to convince various countries to avoid contact with Taiwan. And one example took place in February with the reversal by the government of Guyana on the subject of opening a Taiwanese representative office in the country. There was also some reports that came out more recently, which suggest that China had been in contact with the government of Paraguay, suggesting that shipments of Chinese vaccines may be contingent on Paraguay switching recognition from Taipei to Beijing. So we are definitely starting to see an acceleration of sorts in the diplomatic competition between the 2 governments in the region. Now, with the end of the diplomatic truce and with the more assertive diplomatic moves by Beijing, we are starting to see Taiwan policies begin to widen and deepen its engagement in the region with its own partners in a variety of ways. These have included free trade agreements, including with El Salvador and Panama, despite the fact that both countries recently switched recognition, Guatemala and Honduras as well, and various aid and developmental programs, including with Taiwan's International Cooperation and Development Fund, the ICDF, educational initiatives, including in the areas of languages and medical areas. I'll get back to that in a moment. One report referred to the shift in Taiwan's approach as encompassing so-called sticky power, to engage in policies which allow for a deepening of the relationship on a diplomatic and economic level. A lot of Taiwanese engagement in the LAC region, in a very similar fashion to the Pacific Islands, has been defined by small state diplomacy, including in regards to shelter theory. And this has been in the name of Taiwan seeking to develop its international living space, not only in terms of increasing the deepening of Taipei's diplomatic ties, but also to maintain and develop roles in numerous regional areas, including in the areas of development, cross-regional cooperation, and various forms of institution building. Now, President Tsai has also made extensive use of summit diplomacy, including a Caribbean tour in July of 2019. And key to this has been the use of soft power on Taiwan's part, which has also been at times referred to as cat warrior diplomacy, referring to Taiwan's agility and flexibility. And this has been in contrast to a lot of debate going on about so-called wolf warrior diplomacy emanating from Beijing. Taiwan continues to rely on multi-level engagement with its partners, and this is where shelter theory becomes very important, including on the state level, but also the sub-state and civil society, as well as individual levels. And the difference between the pre-truce and the post-truce era, so pre-2008 and post-2016, is the fact that any kind of direct Beijing-Taipei financial diplomacy is no longer considered viable. So various other options have begun to be sought. So there's been a greater specific focus on accentuating Taiwan's particular diplomatic strengths, including its economic prowess, including in the area of high technologies, which has definitely been under the spotlight recently, human rights policies, democratic tradition, and more recently, its successes in combating the pandemic via initiatives such as the Taiwan Can Help campaign. So where my research has recently gone has been looking at specific case examples of Taiwanese small state diplomacy. And the first case study that I sought to look at in the Caribbean, and I will attempt to share screen, just one moment. Okay, this is working. Has been in the country of St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, what I'm seeking to do once circumstances permit is to return to the region in order to continue work specifically looking at the Caribbean as a case study. But where St. Kitts and Nevis comes in is this can really be seen as a very important case example of how Taiwan's small state diplomacy has evolved over the past few years and how shelter theory is certainly relevant. Now, just to give a very brief overview of the, just one moment. Okay, so just to give a very brief overview of the country. So the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis definitely qualifies as a small state from different parameters. It is the smallest state in terms of land area and population in the Western Hemisphere. It is a country that has had a continuous relationship with Taipei since independence in 1983. And it has an economy which, as I'm going to be explaining in a moment, is also under a certain degree of transition. Even though Taiwan is not the biggest trading partner for St. Kitts and Nevis, you can see, for example, 2018 trade figures, certainly not large, but it is important to look at areas beyond the actual economic numbers. By far, the United States remains the largest trade partner of the country, along with the European Union and the United Kingdom. But where Taiwan becomes very important is how this kind of multifaceted and multi-level diplomacy has come into play. Now, before I do that, just to give a very, quick historical and economic overview. Under British administration, the islands were part of St. Christopher, Nevis, and Anguilla, with Anguilla breaking away in 1980 before St. Kitts and Nevis became independent in 1983. So as you saw by the map, the two major components, St. Kitts and Nevis Nevis itself almost became a small state of its own. That is the flag of Nevis, by the way. I had a chance to visit the island during my research. Nevis held a referendum on independence in 1998, and under the rules, there needed to be a 2/3 majority for the island to become independent. The vote was taken, and 62% voted yes. So it was close, but not quite enough to actually secure independence. So, by the way, I had a chance to speak to some Nevisians during my research, and I know that the whole issue of sovereignty is still very distinct, but that's the subject of another lecture. I spoke to some Nevisians with very strong takes on the subject, so it was very interesting to talk about that. But at the same time, the country has begun to undertake a very significant set of economic changes. The main reason for that is the primary industry in the country, sugar, began to decline in the 1970s just due to shifting global demand. And in July of 2005, the industry officially closed down. So you can see the newspaper piece there, essentially announcing the end of the sugar industry. So there needed to be a shift in economic priority for the country. And tourism has become a major focus of the country's economy. St. Kitts is able to handle cruise ships of considerably large sizes, including the Oasis class, which I think is the biggest class. There's also been a considerable shift towards services, the service industry, and there has been a lot of focus on a diversification of the economy. And this is where relations with Taiwan have become extremely important. Now, despite the comparatively limited amount of trade between SKN and Taiwan, there have been a lot of very distinct economic initiatives, as well as bilateral links, which have served to further solidify the relationship. So some of the ones that I can discuss, and I'll be happy to discuss them further after. In the area, for example, of economic cooperation, I was told by one SKN official that this relationship was robust and engaging. There's been a lot of focus on agricultural projects, including the promotion of food security and adjustment to climate change. Case in point, the ICDF currently oversees a project that deals with information sharing on the potential impact of climate change on the agricultural sector in the country. These links can very easily be considered a form of shelter, which allows for a certain degree of internal economic development, but also a great deal of information sharing. I would say education is also very key here. There have been programs including Mandarin language training, as well as initiatives via the Taiwan Scholarship Program. This has also included various cultural ties programs and vocational training, including in hospitality and tourism, as well as health training. All of this could be considered a form of what has been called societal shelter, meaning cultural transactions which form additional building blocks to trade in building international cooperation. Taiwan has also been assisting with, and I heard quite a bit about this during my work there, digitization programs, including e-government initiatives in the country. Other high-tech initiatives include assistance with solar energy development and related areas. The two countries have also cooperated a great deal in the area of infrastructure as well as tourism development, and there's much hope that the sector will be able to recover soon. And more recently, as a result of the pandemic, Taiwan has been very active with its partners, including in the Caribbean, in the area of providing necessary medical equipment, ventilators, test kits, and temperature gauges, as well as PPE, including masks. It was announced in January, for example, that Taipei would be pledging 600,000 American to procure vaccines for SKN via the Global COVAX initiative. So at the beginning of 2021 saw a considerable shift in regional positions. And I'll conclude here by talking about just how the relationship between Beijing and Taipei has certainly begun to become, I would say, more difficult, with the United States now seen as a wild card in much of the discussion. Cross-strait relations, we are certainly seeing a great deal more difficulty there, and we are starting to see, for example, recent testing of the Chinese military of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and certainly an uptick in the diplomatic competition between the two parties. One thing that is of concern, though, is while there has been a recent tendency to kind of frame the situation with cross-strait relations, in regards to specifically security, hard power, and so forth, and a concentrated effort by Beijing to engage in so-called Taiwan derecognition. It is very important to not look at this particular competition in regards to zero sum in terms of strictly winners and losers, because we are starting to see a very important shift in a lot of Taiwan's external relations thinking that really needs to be studied in terms of how the kind of deepening of diplomatic relations are starting to take place, including in regards to small state diplomacy. Why this is important for Taipei? Well, because most of its remaining partners do fall into the category of small states, there has needed to be a focus on Taipei's part as to how that area is very closely looked at. So where shelter comes in is that we are seeing very significant examples of cooperation between Taipei and its partners, including in the Caribbean and including St Kitts and Nevis, that look at the specific advantages that SKN as a small state has been receiving through the partnership. And it's not simply a question of strategic, it is not simply a question of hard power or material gains. This must also be looked at through a very strong focus on culture, on education, on information sharing, and a greater understanding of what are the specific benefits of these particular sets of bilateral links. So where will things continue? Well, I don't believe that there's going to be a letting up of the derecognition campaign on Beijing's part. I think that is still going to continue. As I said, though, a wild card in this subject is going to be the United States. The United States, after quite a few years of not looking at the region very directly, is in now a position to refocus its efforts. Nevertheless, though, the United States is being called upon now to pay more attention to its southern neighbors. So how that is going to play out is going to be very important to look at. As well, there is certainly not going to be a let up of the competition. There's certainly not going to be a let up in what is going to be a potentially complicated situation with economic recovery. As with the rest of the world, the Caribbean is going to be looking very carefully at the recovery of many key sectors, including in regards to tourism. So just to conclude, I very much hope to continue this research. The plans are to return both to St. Kitts as well as the two other case examples in the region that I'm most interested in looking at, specifically St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And let me just take this opportunity to express my hopes for a very speedy recovery for that country. And I also hope to return to Taipei to continue this research, specifically from a Taiwanese viewpoint. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their attention, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation, and especially the picture at the end. I think everyone was just longing for some beach vibes. I think before we go into Q&A, I would like to remind everyone that you can use the Q&A function on the bottom to pose your questions. But let me start with, I think, two things I'd like you to elaborate on maybe. One is the US role. I mean, you just touched upon it. What do you think the US plays in the recognition of Taiwan in the region? And secondly, what do you think the centennial of the Communist Party in China is going to do to the competition between Beijing and Taipei? Because I mean, I guess Xi Jinping has some kind of goal to be, to present the country as very strong. Do you think there's going to be more competition or more fierce competition maybe in the long run?
Okay, thank you. Two excellent questions. For the first, yeah, I think the United States is very much going to be playing a role in how the diplomatic patterns in the Caribbean are going to play themselves out in the near future. For example, there was a great deal of criticism levied at the fact that some Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, had shifted their diplomatic ties from Taiwan to Beijing over the past few years. But there was very little in the way of follow-up other than the idea that you should not do that. And there has been some frustration expressed by some Caribbean governments that we are waiting for the United States to come forward and to say, well, how are you going to improve the diplomatic situation between the United States and the Caribbean? And more recently, there's been, for example, a bit of frustration expressed that the United States should be doing more with its own vaccine diplomacy in the region, that in many cases, many Caribbean governments have had to look to Asia in order to secure many of its vaccination needs. So there's still kind of a bit of a watch and wait. Like, there is still the idea that even though the United States is concerned about Chinese inroads into the Caribbean and Latin America, there needs to be a kind of counter approach. There needs to be, well, what sort of new diplomacy are you going to offer? So yes, a lot of this question is definitely going to be answered by what the United States does next. And I'm very much hoping that with the Biden government putting a great deal more focus on climate change, on economic recovery, on global cooperation, that the opportunity is there. The second question, yeah, it has been very interesting to look at the shift in Chinese diplomacy, quote unquote, over the past few years. Like the discussion of wolf warrior diplomacy, we've seen many countries that have been directly affected by this in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. And yes, I think quite a bit of it can be attributed to the fact that there is going to be a very important party congress coming up next year. There's going to be a lot of discussion about where the country goes from here. Very important anniversaries that are taking place. And I think there is the focus that China is trying to make, that it is certainly becoming more comfortable with its great and potential global power status. But where this is starting to become obviously very problematic is the issue of the fact that China has now started to become more critical of several governments about their policies, including in regards to Taiwan, including in regards to issues such as maritime security and economic cooperation. So this has certainly made cross-strait relations much more complicated, and it certainly caused problems with other countries that are seeking to balance their great power diplomacy.
All right, thank you so much for elaborating. I think there's going to be a lot more to be discussed in the coming months when we see Xi Jinping maybe stepping up the game, or whatever might come for Beijing. So we have a question from Julian Tucker, who says, "Thank you for a fascinating talk. You mentioned the role of the erratic approach of the Trump administration as a factor in the diplomatic back and forth between the PRC and the ROC. Has the Biden administration signaled a different approach in the Caribbean or Central America?"
Okay, yes, good question. Um, First of all, I would say the ending of the diplomatic truce, I would say, was the kind of first sign that things were going to be shifting very radically, because during the period of the truce, there was no diplomatic recognition that took place between 2008 and 2016. So there was an understanding that everything should stay as is, and there should be a concentration on, for example, improving cross-strait economic ties, improving person-to-person contact. And for the most part, that was quite successful. But with the return to power of the DPP and the election of President Tsai Ing-wen, and the differences over the 1992 consensus, this pretty much eroded any hope of the truce continuing. And it created an atmosphere whereby the competition was back on again, except now we're dealing with a situation whereby China was in a much better position to use checkbook diplomacy to sway allies. Then you get the Trump administration, which, again, to put it diplomatically, had a somewhat mercurial approach to China and Chinese diplomacy. It put a lot of countries off balance. It's not a question of just China not totally sure where the US was standing. On one hand, you had attempts to create good person-to-person relations between President Trump and Xi Jinping. Then you have the start of the trade war in 2018. But this also placed a great deal of many other countries off guard as well. Like, how are we going to be seeing this play out? And Latin America and the Caribbean were certainly not exceptions to this. Add the fact that you had a very, very hands-off approach of the Trump government towards the region, prompting Beijing to increase its ties with many Caribbean states, for example, including Trinidad and Jamaica. And you had a very complicated situation, which I think the United States is going to need to address very quickly. Now, I'm curious to see exactly what is going to happen in regards to President Biden's relations with its southern neighbors, because so far we've seen some very kind of large scale approaches, the idea of improving multilateralism, improving dialogue, and a very, very good sign, the fact that climate change is back on the table. But I think we're still waiting to see exactly what kind of concrete initiatives are going to take place, specifically dealing, for example, with post-pandemic recovery. There are many countries in South America that have experienced a very significant uptick in cases and are also very anxious to obtain greater supplies of vaccines. There's been a great deal of pressure on the Biden government to begin to distribute vaccines more directly abroad, not only to India, but also to the Americas. And I think that there's still a bit of a watch and wait, because the worry is that if we start to see another shift in American policy in 2 years or 4 years, what can be predicted here? So I really think that the time is now to really start putting some concrete ideas on the table. Like, there's not a lot of time.
For sure, I guess I agree with that very statement. What do you think St Kitts and Nevis is expecting in the long run from Taiwan as a diplomatic ally? Viewing it not so much in terms of the geopolitical competition, but more in terms of are we going to see more education focused approaches, or is it going to be more climate change focused? And how much do you think there's a negotiation basis for St Kitts and Nevis to also argue that they want to see more certain niche projects to be carried out by Taipei?
Yes, excellent question. I would say that what Taiwan has really stressed, and I saw a very similar approach during my work in the Pacific Islands, is a very multifaceted area, with the understanding that a lot of these projects are directly connected. Like, for example, climate change, addressing climate change and how they will affect various sectors has been a very key point in a lot of Taiwanese economic diplomacy, with the understanding that we're not just dealing with an environmental crisis, but one which could also very readily affect economic development on several levels. Aid and assistance programs are still very much at the forefront, but there has also been a focus of not necessarily just in terms of material goods, but also the very important focus on education, training, vocational courses, and language training, including Mandarin courses. I had a chance to speak to people specifically on the subject of cooperation in healthcare. So this was in late 2019. Obviously, this is becoming of even greater concern over the past year. So I believe what is being expected pretty much by both sides is that this kind of multi-factor approach will continue, but also the need to ensure that the post-pandemic recovery will be on course and will allow for the resumption of key sectors. And I would say that tourism certainly is at the top of the list, but also to continue to develop the services sector.
Before I go to the next question we got from the audience, maybe you can elaborate, since you've been there for field research, what do the people on the street say about Taiwan's engagement? What's their perception of Taiwan being there as a development partner? Do they generally perceive it as a positive thing, or is there some kind of resentment? Is there Chinese aid that is coming in as well? And how does this play out on the ground?
Yeah, the people I spoke to, including government representatives as well as non-government agencies, the general view is that Taiwan is seen as a very important component in, again, a large number of trade partners, because obviously as a small state, there is definitely a need for a diverse array of trading relationships. And Taiwan is not a major trade partner compared with, let's say, the United States, Canada, Britain, or the European Union. But it is one that is seen as extremely important in regards to the very specific niche areas that the Taiwanese government has provided, including, I would say, especially education and vocational training. So there has been a lot of, I would say, support for Taiwan's very specific niche areas in bilateral relationships. And I would say that even though there has been a lot of discussion about the fact that obviously China is very interested in increasing the number of partners, it has a great deal of economic clout to bring to the region. And certainly I imagine there are certain debates about the future of the relationship. But where I think Taiwan has been successful is to really accentuate the fact that this is not just a relationship based on aid and assistance. This is one where you see a great deal of mutual cooperation simply beyond economics, including in culture, language, history, education. So I think that is going to be kind of the strength of the relationship in the near term. But the fact is, the Caribbean is very likely going to be an area where we're going to be seeing a lot more Chinese involvement. So how that is going to factor into public opinion, it's going to be very important to look at.
I was muted. Okay, try again.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for elaborating. We have a follow-up question on that by Johannes Nordin, who says, following up on the PRC's strengthening of relations with various Caribbean states, are there any instances that have been especially concerning from Washington's perspective?
Yes, good question. And yes, there are some which have certainly caught the attention of the United States. Like, for example, the recent switch in recognition by El Salvador and Dominican Republic was also very key. And the worry is that this would be part of an ongoing chain reaction because China is in a much better position um, to offer checkbook diplomacy to various potential partners. There's also been a lot of uptick in specific types of Chinese investment in its Caribbean partners, not only in regards to kind of emerging areas such as tourism, but also so-called sunset industries, like, for example, various agricultural sectors like sugar that are certainly not seen as important as they were a few decades ago. So China is seen as kind of the alternative economic partner for many of these countries, but also the fact that countries are now being encouraged to join the Belt and Road, to develop Belt and Road agreements. And that is obviously a concern considering the proximity of the Caribbean to the United States. So how is that going to factor into the strategic competition between Beijing and Washington? So I think we are definitely going to be seeing, again, as we start heading into the post-pandemic period, China being looked at as a very key alternative partner for various recovery projects. So I think it's good that Washington is starting to pay more attention to this. So I'll be curious to see what specific policies will come about.
For sure. Okay, we have another question from Frida Lindberg, who says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Have the ties between St Kitts and Nevis on the one hand and Taiwan on the other changed in any way as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? And if so, in what ways?
Okay. Well, I can answer that in terms of the viewpoint of the SKN, but I can also respond to that in regards to the Caribbean as a whole. Now, Taiwan has been engaging in a concerted campaign, first of all, to generally advertise its approaches to the coronavirus, to say that we have been very successful in combating the pandemic in Taiwan, and that there's been an effort to bring this expertise to our friends and partners. So I mentioned the Taiwan Can Help campaign. This has been something which has been looked at very carefully in the Caribbean region. But Taiwan has also, as I mentioned, provided a great deal of both protective equipment and plans to distribute vaccines to St. Kitts through the COVAX initiative. So Taiwan has kind of acted as an interlocutor to many of its friends and allies to ensure that vaccine shipments are given to the region. And so I would say that, if anything, the pandemic has certainly strengthened the health relationship between Taiwan and St. Kitts in many ways. So I see that as a very positive sign. Now, stepping back and looking at the greater Caribbean, however, we are certainly starting to see a great deal of vaccine diplomacy on China's part. Because of the fact that the United States has been seen as not being as active as it could be in distributing vaccines to the region, Asia as a whole has started to step in, including China, to provide its own kind of brand of vaccine diplomacy to its own Caribbean partners. So there's been a little bit of, I wouldn't go as far as to say diplomatic competition, but certainly the idea that, okay, we can also engage in effective vaccine diplomacy here. And this is another area where I would say the United States needs to step in, because this is an area which obviously is going to grow in importance as we hopefully very quickly get into the post-pandemic situation.
Definitely. I mean, just harking back on the US, I think the US is pretty much, it's their backyard, so they're going to be very much concerned about what's happening there. But I was wondering, what would European partners maybe think about it? So the Dutch or the French, the British even, because they still have very close ties to many of the Caribbean states. So what do you think they're gonna do in the long run?
Okay, I can certainly talk about British approaches, because what is happening in Britain right now, because it is also starting to head into a post-pandemic phase. But as a result of Brexit, there has been a lot of discussion about creating a distinct British foreign policy, one where there's a little bit more daylight from the European Union. And we're starting to see this being manifested, first of all, in closer strategic cooperation with the United States, including in areas of maritime security. We're starting to see Britain pay more closer attention, for example, to the Pacific Islands region, and we're starting to see it in the Caribbean. The UK is still a major trading partner for St Kitts and Nevis. It has been seeking to improve diplomatic relations with many Caribbean states, including its overseas holdings in the region. And this has provided the UK with a greater opportunity to, again, stress health diplomacy and to suggest that Britain is now in kind of a very distinct position to improve economic development and overall diplomacy in the Caribbean. But again, though, we're still waiting for concrete policies in many cases because we're still kind of dealing with the aftershocks of the Brexit situation. So how foreign policy is actually going to shake out beyond preliminary speeches, I'm going to be looking at that very closely. But I can say, though, that when I was in Basseterre, subject to the UK came up quite often. And certainly there has been a great deal of talk about improving ties between the country and Britain, as well as getting Britain more involved in Caribbean level initiatives. So Britain is certainly a player.
Right. I'm just wondering, given that we're going to probably see more of a competition between Taipei and Beijing in the long run, what do you think the presence of Britain or France is going to do in the region? I mean, they seem to be stepping up and because of various security interests, I guess. But what do you think this is going to do in the long term in terms of maybe multilateral engagements? Are we going to see some kind of overlap of policy? Might there be some kind of cooperation with Taiwan in the region, especially in St Kitts and Nevis? Or do you think that's too optimistic to think about?
Oh, it's definitely not too optimistic. And I think that like one area that's being looked at very carefully is the various kind of multilateral cooperation initiatives in the Caribbean, especially those that have started to appear over the past few years. These have obviously been downgraded over the past year or so, and I believe there'll be a great deal of enthusiasm for face-to-face diplomacy once circumstances permit. And again, this is kind of a window of opportunity for not just for Taiwan, but also for many other countries, including in Europe, to essentially say, okay, we want to be back in the game. We want to be able to discuss how the post-pandemic economic recovery, as well as a renewal of political ties, is actually going to play itself out. Because it is going to be a very, I'd say, a very complicated process to bring together, like to put back together various industries, including tourism. So the idea that, okay, we're going to need this kind of multilateral cooperation is going to be very important here. Now, as for Taiwan, just to bring Taiwan back into the question, like what Taiwan has also been trying to stress in its particular type of diplomacy, it's not just a question of Taiwan wants to maintain strong relations with its friends and partners, but it also wants to be involved in various regimes and structures. Discussions about post-pandemic healthcare situations in the Caribbean, economic recovery, cultural ties, the development or the recovery of various sectors. A lot of Taiwanese diplomacy also needs to be looked at in regards to information sharing, but also providing a platform, a voice beyond simple politics to say, okay, this is what we feel should be done. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of similar viewpoints come out of many European capitals. And I'm hoping the United States will join them.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to simply view the Caribbean at this stage in terms of geopolitical competition, and that you don't see the domestic needs. That there's a lot more to it than just Beijing, Taipei, and Washington. I mean, I guess you've spoken to local researchers or politicians. Maybe, what is their perception of what is going on? Do they see this solely in terms of political competition, or do they have other interests that they bring forward or that they bring to the table when they discuss with Taipei policy-wise?
Yeah, among the officials I talked to, like this has been a region, the Caribbean has been a region, along with the Pacific Islands, a very long-standing competition between Beijing and Taipei. So there's the idea that almost along the lines of here we go again, that there was a grace period for 8 years, but now we are back to this kind of very intense recognition diplomacy taking place. But circumstances have changed because there is the question of, well, will the United States still be able to continue having the very large role that it traditionally has? Like The United States is still the largest economic partner. That is not going to change anytime soon. But in terms of US influence, in terms of US diplomacy, yes, there has been some concerns expressed about whether the US will be able to return to the position that it had been, let's say, 5, 10 years ago. Then we have the question of, okay, now China is starting to become much more direct in its economic diplomacy. It is now starting to engage in a series of carrot and stick initiatives to say, well, these are the benefits and this is the possible problems if you don't recognize this. So we're definitely not seeing the same amount of subtlety that one would see pre-2008. And yeah, there is a concern in not only St. Kitts, but also in other Caribbean countries, that how is that going to factor into our specific regional interests, especially at a very difficult economic time? Because in many cases, many of the industries that are now starting to grow in importance, including tourism, services, high technology, will require a large number of different partners. So being forced into kind of an either-or situation is not something which small states particularly relish. And that is definitely an area where there's a lot of comparison to be made with the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands, because we're seeing the same concern about, can we maintain a certain amount of omnidirectional diplomacy under these kinds of conditions?
I think just harking back on the point of being caught between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, when it comes to this kind of diplomatic management. I mean, we have seen several Caribbean states switch recognition to Beijing in recent years. Has there been a discussion in St. Kitts and Nevis that there might be a switch in the making, or do you think that that relationship with Taipei is strong, that is not going to be affected by Beijing's very assertive policy towards the region?
Well, I heard from, and let me stress these are non-governmental officials, about the idea that, okay, this is a consideration. This is something which certainly needs to be discussed. However, from members of government in SKN who I had a chance to speak to, I heard very, very strong appreciation for what Taiwan has done in regards to political and economic partnerships. Now, again, there is the understanding that the diplomatic situation between Beijing and Taipei is starting to spill over more directly into the Caribbean, and this is something that has to be very carefully looked at. But in terms of how this is kind of factored onto the governmental level, I haven't heard any serious discussion about, has there been any direct impact on our current Taiwanese relations. But certainly the question is kind of floating around a bit in various quarters. But you look at, for example, the most recent initiatives that Taiwan has undertaken in regards to assisting with the pandemic situation. And that further underscores the fact that Taiwanese diplomacy has been very beneficial, not only in terms of straight economics, but also in terms of health and various other related sectors.
Yeah, I guess you never really know when things are going to happen. We have another question from Frida Lindberg. Could you elaborate a bit on what the cultural exchange looks like in practice between Taiwan and St. Kitts and Nevis?
Okay, many different examples of that. I mentioned, for example, Mandarin language training that is offered to Kittitians and Nevisians who want to learn the language, who want to, like either for business purposes or for interest. Taiwan has also invested in various infrastructure programs designed to improve various cultural areas, including, for example, parks and community centers. And there are also various programs offered either through the ICDP or the Taiwan Fellowship, which allows for culture, language, and educational related initiatives to take place. So again, a very interesting comparison with the Pacific Islands, just the amount of emphasis there has been on educational cooperation, information sharing, and exchange. Like, it's been very interesting to look at that as a kind of a main focus of the diplomatic ideas.
Did you take part in any of these activities when you were there? Or?
Not directly, because I was quite busy with my work. But one of the reasons why I'm very much looking forward to going back to have a better idea, because there are many cultural initiatives that have taken place, and I imagine there's going to be quite a bit of interest in reviving them as soon as possible, especially as tourism recovers. But yeah, the I would say cultural cooperation has also been a major cornerstone of the diplomatic relationship.
I mean, given that these small states, and especially St Kitts and Nevis, is not big population-wise, maybe the economy has taken a blow in the pandemic. Do you think that the cultural exchanges and the language courses that Taiwan offers, do you think that's going to offer St Kitts and Nevis young people a chance to maybe be some kind of interlink between Taiwan and St Kitts and Nevis in the long run? Do you think they're going to be some kind of like cultural ambassadors? What do you see?
Yes, absolutely. It goes back to the research that I was looking at about how the bilateral relationship is not only multifaceted, but also multi-level. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, including in the media, over the diplomatic competition between Beijing and Taipei, summit diplomacy, and so forth. And that is very important. Like one distinguishing point with diplomacy under President Tsai over the past few years has been summit diplomacy, has been direct visits when possible. And I'm sure that is going to be revived as soon as situation allows it. But at the same time, we're starting to see a much greater focus when looking at Taiwanese diplomacy on kind of sub-state areas of cooperation. That includes engaging with younger populations, engaging with different sectors, going back to education in order to demonstrate that it's not simply about government to government relations. It is not strictly about that. It is also trying to deepen the relationship in various areas. And that is very consistent with shelter theory, the idea that when looking at the benefits of both actors in a particular relationship, it's important to note what are the goods that are experienced by the smaller state, not only in terms of just economic benefits, but also in terms of information sharing and support.
For sure. I would like to give you the opportunity to say like final remarks because we're unfortunately approaching the end of the webinar for today. I guess when you discuss a lot, then time flies. So please feel free to like state whatever you think is still relevant. And yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will say that I'm looking very forward to continuing this research in the next few months, hopefully as soon as possible. And I very much hope that the situation pretty much around the world will improve for everyone in that regard. But I would also say that this has been a very interesting case of looking at various examples of diplomacy through kind of a non-traditional lens, going beyond kind of the idea of government to government or state to state. That this really kind of illustrates the fact that when looking at small state diplomacy, it is very important to look at it from a variety of different angles. And I'd say it's been very positive, looking at, for example, the development of shelter theory as well as critical theory in small state studies, to really kind of underscore the fact that there are many different lenses that need to be used in order to understand where small states fit in with international relations. In regards to the Caribbean, yeah, there is going to, I'd say this is going to be a region which is going to be very important in regards to study in this area, because not only of the kind of growth or return, however you want to call it, of great power diplomacy, but also the fact that we are starting to see actors that are looking at these diplomatic relations, not only Taiwan, but you mentioned Europe, and I would say probably other actors within the Americas themselves, that are really starting to look at diplomacy in much different ways. And I think the after effects of the pandemic is really going to underscore the fact that there are many, many different types of diplomacy which are key in order to build relationships. So I think there is going to be a lot of study ahead here.
It sounds very fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. So, especially in terms of geopolitics, we're going to see big movements from China. We're going to see renewed U.S. policy focus on the region, especially in terms of climate change. And I think climate change especially is going to be a big issue for the Caribbean as well, just as the Pacific Islands. So I think there's going to be lots of discussion points that we can bring up in the near future. So thank you so much for elaborating on St. Kitts and Nevis. I think it's very, very fascinating to zoom into a region that is not getting as much attention here in Europe as it probably should, especially given that the competition between Taipei and Beijing is probably going to play out there in many ways. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very insightful, very thought-provoking. Thank you to the audience for asking very good questions. And I wish you all a good day. So bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.